available, so he's going to come and video that and put it up on YouTube, all right? I'll collaborate it as well, but typically the distance students say that the YouTube video is much clearer than the Collaborate archive, all right? So that lecture will relate to your physical activity log for class. So when you're being asked to identify whether your activity is moderate or vigorous intensity, and you don't know how to measure intensity yet, so that lecturing class will give you that information, because otherwise we don't cover it until way at the end of the semester in the book. All right? So that will help you out trying to pull your physical activity log information together. Does that make sense? All right? So that's the first bit. And then if you're missing class on Friday, then again, we'll have that as a Collaborate archive and as a YouTube video so that you can keep up. And it's a good semester to be missing because I have an online section, so I have to be doing all this videoing. All right? So you'll be able to keep up and not miss a lecture for next week. Okay? All right. Let's see.
Recording started.
Okay. All right, so before we look at adaptations in system number 2, glycolysis, now that you've had the weekend to kind of percolate info, does anybody have questions on system number 1, how that works, or questions on how system number 2 works that you want me to review before we continue? No? All right, so remember that glycolysis system number 2 runs from around 30 seconds, not runs, but it is predominantly the main ATP system from 30 seconds to about 2.5, 3 minutes. All right, and this should give you a hint that it's breaking down carbohydrate. And so when we look at adaptations, remember that adaptations are typically positive. It's the body's response to stressing it, and it's going to make you better at doing the thing you're stressing it for. Right? So if we're breaking down carbohydrate, then one of the adaptations we see is an increase in the level of carbohydrate that's available within the muscle cell. All right, so stored carbohydrate is glycogen. Okay. So if we train system 2, then we see increases in the level of glycogen storage within muscle cells, particularly the cells that are doing the work. So if I'm a runner, I'm going to see a lot more increase in glycogen storage in my legs than I will in my arms. I'll get a little bit in my arms depending on whether I'm a sprinter or a distance runner, right? But most of the adaptation is going to occur in the muscles that are doing the work. Right? And then we're going to get even more specific about that idea in a couple of chapters. Okay. Now, because system 2 is a feeder system for system 3, aerobic metabolism, I can also train system 2 by doing endurance training, right? So I either have to train it directly doing practice that is 30 seconds to 2.5, 3 minutes long, or I can do endurance training, and that will also train system 2. And logically, if what I'm doing is weight training or sprinting or throwing activities, I see no difference in glycogen levels because those activities would use system 1 and system 1 doesn't use carbohydrate. Right? So the adaptation occurs based on the event I'm doing and what system I'm using. Right? If I want to train glycogen stores using weights and sprints, then we have to start doing kind of HIIT programs or interval training, something where I'm not getting a rest in between sets. Right? So as the activity gets longer, glycolysis becomes more important and we see more adaptation in stored glycogen. So that's the second set of adaptation. The first set of adaptation we covered on Friday was the adaptation in the enzymes that work within the glycolytic chain. Right? So the second adaptation we see that makes us better at doing this activity is adaptation in carbohydrate storage. And the third set of adaptations that we see is looking at this idea of the buffers. Right? So remember, when I'm working in glycolysis, I'm releasing hydrogen ions that impact the acidity level of the cell. And over time, as those hydrogen ions build up, we see fatigue in the system because the enzymes don't like that acidity, and so they slow down. Right? The more buffer I have available, the more alkaline or base substance that's available in the cell, the longer I've got before that acidity builds up because the buffers balance it out for a little while. All right? So if I've got more buffers available, I've got more balance available, so I get a bit longer until I get into fatigue. So things that act as buffers, some proteins, phosphate groups, bicarbonate. Right? So we can do bicarbonate loading, for example. Right? And some people will do bicarbonate loading. It can cause some gastrointestinal issues, cramping, gas. So for some people, bicarbonate loading produces so much discomfort that it kind of counteracts the fact that you've got this little bit of bonus going on, right? So you might not want to use bicarbonate loading. It depends upon the individual. It's not something that is banned. It's not considered particularly dangerous. It just can be very uncomfortable for some people, right? Trying to see where, somewhere in here, they give you a might be when we get back to the ergogenicades. Right, so you can use bicarbonate, sodium bicarbonate. I think probably the information is in the later chapter. Some people find that sodium citrate doesn't cause as much GI tract discomfort. You have to balance it with a lot of water. There's kind of techniques around. But technically, if I give the system more buffer, I would delay fatigue in an event that's using that system. Okay.
When would be the best time to be taking those the day of a race be like?
No, I think probably in training. I'll double check that for you. I'm not sure that, I think probably, I could be wrong, but I think probably the recommendation would be to use it in training so that you can train harder rather than risk the GI tract issues on the day of an actual race. But I'll double check. I have another textbook that will give me more info about that. So. Okay. So, we're going to look at the interaction. And the first thing to realize is that although we tend to talk about the three systems as three separate entities, actually all of them are working most of the time, unless you're at an extreme on either end of the continuum. And so when we talk about a particular system being the one that's making the ATP for that event, means that it's predominantly making the ATP for that event, not that the other two systems have switched off. All right? So, anaerobic events, right? Depending upon the length of them, if they're very short, very high intensity, then they're going to rely on ATP and phosphocreatine that is already in the muscle cell. Right? So I don't have to use a food group for those very short, very high intensity type activities. Okay, high jumping, diving. We said that system 1, ATP-PC system, runs to around 25 to 30 seconds. All right, so what you've got to think about is, if I asked you to sprint as hard as you can, right, as hard as you can, how long can you keep that up? Right, 5, 6, 7 seconds, depending upon your training. Around 8 seconds or so, 10 seconds, you're going to start slowing down. And if you're not slowing down, then you didn't go out as hard as you could at the beginning. Right? And at over 30 seconds, you're going to get slower and slower and slower, even though you're trying to go as hard as you can, because system 1 can't maintain that power output for very long. Right? If I have to keep running, then I'm going to start predominantly using system 2. At the point I use system 2, I cannot be working at 100% intensity, or 99, or 98, 97% intensity. Because system 2 involves breaking down carbohydrate, and even though it's a small molecule, it takes time. Right? So at the point that I'm working 30 seconds to 2.5 minutes, I'm no longer working at full capacity, because that's not possible for that long. Does that make sense in your terminology, right? If you think about your sport, okay? So these very, very short, if you're a power lifter or you're an Olympic lifter, shot put, high jump, long jump, right? 100-meter sprint or a 50-meter indoor sprint. Or if you're a swimmer diving off the podium at the gun, right? That initial high-intensity leap dive off the podium would be system 1. And then as you hit the water and start swimming, within a couple of strokes, you're going to transition into system 2. Right? On the other end of the spectrum, if I'm doing something that is very, very, very long, then necessarily my intensity has to be lower. Right? So I'm going to be working, hopefully not at low intensity, because there aren't a lot of health benefits if I'm working at low intensity. It's better than nothing. You know, when I go out to the trail and I see people who are overweight and they're walking like this, you know, there's part of me wants to go quicker, right? And there's part of me goes, you know what, they're out and they're on their feet and they're moving. That's a start. Right? So, we can work at low intensity. When you're sitting like this is low intensity. Right? So when you're sitting in class, that's aerobic metabolism. Now you are using oxygen to make most of the energy you need to keep your heart beating, to keep your digestion going, to keep you warm, to make sure you're sitting upright and not falling off the chair because all your muscles turned off, right? All those postural muscles that have you sitting are all using ATP to contract to keep you sitting upright. Okay? So that's all aerobic because it's very low intensity. Moderate intensity for a long period of time is also aerobic. And if you're a world-class runner, what they call moderate is basically high intensity for the rest of us. Because anyone who can run a marathon in 2 hours and 2 minutes is running pretty damn fast, right? But they're freakoids, right? That's still not high, very high intensity for that body, right? It's just for the rest of us, we look at that and go, oh, I couldn't even run 100 meters that fast, let alone a marathon, right? Okay. So long duration, low or moderate intensity work, right, relies on oxygen to make ATP. And that's going to be chapter 3 that we will start on Wednesday. Right? So marathons, biking, swimming distances, going out for a walk with the dog, right? Walking around Walmart, raking leaves, vacuuming your house, all of that is aerobic work. Right? And that's the element that I want you to concentrate on in your physical activity log. Okay? Doesn't have to be exercise, it just has to be aerobic work. So if you go to Walmart and you do your whole week shop in one go and it takes you 45, 50 minutes to get around, that's an aerobic. Now, if you walk around Walmart like this, it's low intensity, so you shouldn't be counting it in your minutes because your minutes are meant to be moderate or vigorous, right? So it means that you've got to tackle Walmart. Okay? Okay? So if we understand this idea, right, that we're going to use different systems to create energy for different events, then that plays into why specificity of training is so important. So the principle of specificity of training comes into play because if I'm an aerobic athlete, I may want to sprint to the finish line. Right? So I need to, bless you, I need to do some sprint training to be able to sprint to the line. But 95% of my training should not be sprinting if 95% of my event is moderate intensity running, right? So if you can swap that around. If I'm a football player, then a football play in and of itself is anaerobic, right? It's not very often that they are moving for more than 2 minutes at a time, if that. Then they will stop and walk off and swap over, and it's all very boring. sorry if you're a football fan. Right? But the game lasts 3 hours. So a 3-hour event is aerobic, but my actual playing football is anaerobic. So I should do most of my training as anaerobic, but I need to do some aerobic training to make sure that when we get to the end of the fourth quarter, I'm still able to sprint and catch and throw really hard. Right? So specificity of training lines up with which system am I using? How much of it am I using? Right? How do my training program should align with the energy requirements of the event that I'm doing? Right? So, this is an estimate, all right? You can use it as a guideline. Okay. The top blue line is anaerobic percentage of ATP production. The bottom red line is aerobic ATP production, all right? So down this end of the continuum, we've got anything that is 1 to 3 seconds is basically predominantly anaerobic. It's ATP-PC. Okay? If I come up the other end of the continuum and I'm looking at something that is longer, that is 2 hours or longer, then if you are maintaining a steady pace during that 2 hours, that work is predominantly almost 100% aerobic, right? Unless you hit a hill or you want to sprint to overtake someone. In order to sprint, you have to turn on ATP-PC, right? And then anything in between. Right? So on the continuum, we have overlap, right? If we are working for about 2 minutes, then we've got a lot of anaerobic, but my aerobic is starting to get ready to kick in, assuming that it assumes you're going to keep moving, right? So I think in the next chapter, if not, you can certainly look online. You can find tables that will give you by sport the percentage of anaerobic versus aerobic work within that sport, on average, right? So the longer the sprint, the greater the percentage of ATP is going to come from glycolysis. So if I'm looking at a 400-meter sprint, a lot of that energy is coming from glycolysis, not from ATP-PC, because it's too long. If I look at successive sprint bouts, so if I'm doing interval training and I'm using sprinting, but I've got a rest in between each sprint, but not a very long rest, the shorter the rest is, the more I'm moving, the more likely I am to hit aerobic metabolism. So I can use sprinting, this is where HIIT comes in, right? Because HIIT is high intensity, so technically that has to be anaerobic. But if I do high intensity with very little rest in between each activity, then we start to work aerobically, and that's why HIIT can be so beneficial for losing fat mass. But you can't use it with a regular person, right? The intensity is too high for Joe Blow average. Okay? That HIIT is for someone who is already in shape. Right? You can't really use HIIT for a beginner. You would have to get them into pretty good shape before you could use that idea. Okay. There's information about, so if you do 40-meter sprints and you want to train system 1, then you need nearly 2 minutes rest in between your 40-meter sprint for system 1 to completely resynthesize. Right? If you have less than 2 minutes, then really you start training glycolysis. Okay, does that make sense? Let me draw that. Okay. So, if I do 40 meters, I'm going to use ATP-PC. I'm going to break down on my ATP, and I'm going to break down quite a bit of my phosphocreatine. So I need a long break before I do the next 40 meters, if what I want to train is that system. Right? So this needs to be about 2 minutes if I'm training system 1. But I could use 40 meters, give myself a 45-second rest, run another 40 meters, and now I'm going to start hitting glycolysis. Right? So as I said, this idea of specificity of training becomes really important, because if I get the rest period wrong, I'm training the wrong system. And then I go to compete, and I don't do very well because I trained the wrong energy system. Right? So being a good coach means being a really good scientist. Because there's a lot of very clever stuff going on, and if you get it just a little bit wrong, the outcome is not going to be what you want. Right? It's like peaking for an event. You see it quite a lot in tennis, right? At Grand Slams, which are 2-week events. And you see someone who's touted to do very, very well, and they breeze through the first week easily, and then they start petering out in week 2, and then they get knocked out in the quarterfinal or the semi-final when everybody expected them to make the final, because they timed it slightly wrong, right? Same with racing. If I've got 3 major races in the year, then I've got to work out how am I going to peak so I'm in good shape for that race at that time. Or am I going to blow off one of the races and go, okay, which of the 3 are the 2 most important? I'm going to use the other one as a training run. Because maybe they're all too close together and I can't peak 3 times in a row like that. Okay. So it's really, really clever stuff. I'm not very good at it. I'm really not that good because I haven't spent enough time doing it and using it. Okay. All right, let's see, what else do we have here for you? Oh, that's just a different graphic, so it's saying the same thing, basically. This is a 3-second sprint, right? So the estimation, and this is going to be average, it will be different for every individual.
right? On average, during a 3-second sprint, they say that about 32% of your energy for that 3 seconds is coming from your stored ATP in the muscle cell. 55% of your energy is coming from phosphocreatine that is being broken down and then we're resynthesizing ATP. 10% is coming from ongoing carbohydrate glycolysis metabolism that's underlying all the time. And 3% is coming from underlying aerobic metabolism that's just going on all the time. Oops. Uh-oh. Okay. All right, so I think that's the last slide. Yes. All right, so it can get very, very, very complicated. All right, so what I want you to think about is we're trying to keep it simple for now. What's the big picture of what's going on? All right. How do I use that information so that I understand, do I want a 2-minute rest or a 45-second rest? Am I trying to build muscle? Am I trying to maintain? Am I trying to lose fat mass? I have to decide what the goal is, and then as we build this picture, chapter by chapter, you'll see how we use this information to target specific goals. Okay? All right, so again, if you didn't get a chance at the weekend, please review System 1 and System 2 before Wednesday, because on Wednesday we're going to use that feeder system to start System 3. All right? So you need to have a clear picture of when and why I use System 1 and System 2.